When a desperate mother steps onto an auction block to sell herself for her baby's survival, she catches the eye of a lonely rancher whose bid will change both their lives forever. But when shadows from her past threaten to destroy the fragile love they've built, will their bond prove strong enough to withstand the ultimate test of worth? The wooden platform creaked under Eliza's bare feet, as 43 pairs of eyes studied her like she was a prized horse at market. August heat pressed down on the Kansas Territory town of Millbrook in 1867, making her faded blue dress stick to her back with nervous sweat. Baby Mercy squirmed against her chest, tiny fingers grasping at the worn fabric that had once been her Sunday best. "What am I bid for this fine young woman?" Auctioneer Bill Hutchins called out, his voice carrying across the dusty main street. "She's got all her teeth, strong back, and as you can see, she's proven she can bear children." Eliza's cheeks burned with shame. The for sale sign beneath her feet might as well have been her tombstone. 3 months ago, she'd been a respectable widow trying to make ends meet. Now she stood on display like a piece of furniture, hoping some stranger would pay enough to keep her daughter from starving. The crowd below buzzed with interest. Weathered ranchers rubbed their stubbled chins, calculating her worth in dollars and work hours. Town merchants whispered behind their hands, some looking sorry for her, others sizing her up like livestock. A few women in the crowd shook their heads and turned away, unable to watch what desperation had driven her to do. "Do I hear $20? Hutchins continued, his practiced eyes scanning the gathered faces. "This girl's barely 22, plenty of good years left in her." Eliza wanted to disappear. She wanted to grab Mercy and run until her legs gave out, until they found some place where no one knew her story. But running took money, and money was exactly what she didn't have. Her last coins had gone to buy milk for Mercy, when her own body had failed to produce enough. 25, called out Pete Morrison, who owned the grain mill. His wife had died 2 winters back, leaving him with 3 boys to raise. Eliza had seen him at church, always sitting in the back pew, looking lost and overwhelmed. 30, shouted someone else from the crowd. The numbers climbed slowly, painfully. Each bid felt like another piece of her dignity being stripped away. She closed her eyes and tried to remember better times, dancing at the harvest festival with her late husband Jonathan, planning their future together, dreaming of the family they'd build. Those dreams seemed like stories someone else had told her now. Mercy started to fuss, her little face scrunching up in preparation for a full cry. Eliza bounced her gently, humming a lullaby her own mother had sung. The baby's eyes, bright blue like her father's, looked up at her with complete trust. That trust was both a blessing and a curse. It meant everything to know someone loved her completely, but it also meant she'd do anything, even this, to keep that little life safe. A commotion near the general store caught her attention. A tall man in a worn brown coat was arguing with the shopkeeper about something. His dark hair needed cutting, and his face looked like he'd forgotten how to smile. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but his movements were sharp, angry. $35! This came from Jeremiah Morse, and Eliza's stomach dropped. She knew Morse's reputation. He went through hired help faster than most people went through coffee. The women who worked for him never stayed long, and they rarely talked about why they left. 40, Pete Morrison called out, his voice strained. Eliza could see him counting coins in his palm, probably calculating how much he could afford without letting his boys go hungry. The bidding continued, each number driving her further from any hope of maintaining her dignity. She thought about her parents, both dead from fever 3 years back. What would they think of their daughter now? Would they understand that sometimes a mother had to make impossible choices? $50. Morse's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. The crowd fell quiet. $50 was serious money in Millbrook. That was 2 months' wages for most working men. Eliza saw Pete Morrison's shoulders slump in defeat. He couldn't match that bid, not with 3 children depending on him. 50 going once, Hutchins called out, his voice taking on the rhythmic chant of a man closing a deal. The angry man by the general store had stopped arguing and was now staring directly at her. His eyes were dark, troubled, but not cruel. Something in his expression reminded her of her own reflection lately. the look of someone who'd lost something precious and was still figuring out how to keep breathing. 50 going twice. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. In a few seconds, she'd belong to Jeremiah Morse, and God only knew what that would mean for her and Mercy. She'd heard whispers about his last housekeeper, how she'd left town in the middle of the night with bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes. The stranger stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. The crowd turned to look at him, curiosity replacing the auction fever that had gripped them moments before. He was tall, probably in his 30s, with the kind of lean strength that came from hard work rather than easy living. $75, he said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the still air. The crowd's attention shifted like a flock of birds changing direction. Eliza felt her breath catch as she studied the stranger who'd just doubled the highest bid. He stood with his hands at his sides, not fidgeting or showing off, just waiting to see what would happen next. Well, Hutchins said, his auctioneer's instincts kicking in. Looks like we have ourselves a real contest. Do I hear 80? Jeremiah Morse's face had gone red with anger and embarrassment. Being outbid was one thing, but being outbid by that much was a public humiliation. 85, he called out, his voice tight with fury. The stranger didn't even blink. $100. A gasp went through the crowd. $100 was more money than most people in Millbrook saw in half a year. It was enough to buy a decent horse, or a winter's worth of supplies, or a small plot of land. The fact that someone was willing to pay it for her made Eliza feel dizzy. "Who is that man?" someone whispered. "Marcus Reed," another voice answered. "Lives out east of town. Keeps to himself mostly. Heard he came out here from St. Louis about 2 years back. Something about a woman who'd done him wrong." Eliza studied this Marcus Reed more carefully. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind a working man wore when he took care of his things but didn't have money for new ones. His boots were scuffed but well-maintained. Everything about him suggested someone who worked hard and minded his own business. 100 going once, Hutchins called out, his voice betraying his excitement at the unexpected windfall. Morse looked ready to explode. His face had gone from red to purple, and his hands were clenched into fists. But even his pride had limits, and $100 was beyond what he could afford, especially for something as uncertain as a woman and baby. 100 going twice. Marcus Reed's eyes met hers across the crowd. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The auction, the crowd, the humiliation. His gaze was steady, neither leering nor calculating. He was looking at her like she was a person, not a thing to be bought. When had someone last looked at her that way? "Sold," Hutchins brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. "To Marcus Reed for $100. The crowd began to disperse, already moving on to the next piece of business. Some lingered to watch the transaction, curious about this unexpected turn of events. Others headed toward the saloon, ready to discuss what they'd witnessed over drinks and cards. Eliza remained frozen on the platform, holding Mercy close. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in slowly, like cold water seeping through her boots. She belonged to Marcus Reed now. Her life, her future, her daughter's future, all of it was in the hands of a man she'd never spoken to. Reed approached the platform, pulling a leather wallet from his coat pocket. His movements were careful, deliberate, like someone who'd learned to think before acting. He counted out the bills and handed them to Hutchins, who made a show of examining each one. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Reed," Hutchins said with a greasy smile. "Hope you're satisfied with your purchase." Reed's jaw tightened at the word purchase, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Eliza, his expression softening slightly. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat, "I'm Marcus Reed. I know this is unusual circumstances, but I want you to know that I'm not expecting." "What you paid for?" Eliza finished, surprised by her own boldness. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "That's right." He seemed relieved that she'd spoken first. "I have a homestead, about 5 miles east of here. It's not fancy, but it's clean and safe. There's a separate room where you and your baby could have privacy." Eliza shifted Mercy to her other arm. The baby's weight, a constant reminder of why she was in this position. What would you want in return, Mr. Reed? Help with the household. Cooking, cleaning, maybe some mending. Nothing more than what any hired hand would do. He paused, glancing at Mercy. Though I suppose most hired hands don't come with children. And if I refuse? If I take your money and run? Marcus Reed was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then I suppose I'd be out $100 and you'd still be running. Can't say I'd blame you, given the circumstances. His honesty surprised her. Most men who just spent that kind of money would have made threats or demands. This man seemed to understand that money couldn't buy respect or affection, only time and proximity. I need to know, Eliza said, looking directly into his eyes. Are you a good man, Mr. Reed? Because I've got a daughter to protect, and I can't afford to make another mistake. I try to be, he answered simply. Can't promise I'm perfect, but I can promise I won't hurt you or your baby. That's about all any man can promise, I suppose. Mercy chose that moment to let out a small cry, and Marcus Reed's expression changed. The hardness in his eyes softened as he looked at the baby, and Eliza saw something she hadn't expected: longing. This was a man who'd wanted children of his own, she realized. Whatever had brought him to Kansas territory alone, it hadn't been his choice. What's her name? He asked. Mercy, Eliza replied. That's a good name. Strong name. He looked back at Eliza. I've got a wagon around back. If you're ready, we can head out to the homestead. It's getting late, and I'd like to get you both settled before dark. Eliza took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She was about to leave everything familiar behind and trust her life to a complete stranger. But what choice did she have? The alternative was going back to the streets with a baby, and that was no choice at all. I'm ready, she said, though she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for what came next. But as Marcus Reed helped her down from the platform, his touch gentle and respectful, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Marcus Reed's wagon rolled through endless waves of prairie grass that stretched toward the horizon like a golden ocean. The silence between him and Eliza felt thick enough to cut with a knife, broken only by the creaking wheels and Mercy's occasional whimpers. Eliza clutched her small carpet bag on her lap, everything she owned in the world reduced to what could fit in one worn piece of luggage. Her other hand supported Mercy, who seemed fascinated by the moving landscape despite her young age. The baby's wide blue eyes tracked the swaying grass like she was trying to memorize this new world. How long have you lived out here? Eliza asked, needing to break the awkward quiet that had settled over them. 2 years this fall, Marcus replied, his eyes fixed on the dirt road ahead. Bought the land from a family heading back east. They said the isolation got to them. And it doesn't bother you, being so far from town? Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Eliza wondered if she'd asked something too personal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't expected. Sometimes a man needs distance from other people to figure out who he really is. The wagon hit a deep rut, jostling them both. Marcus quickly reached over to steady Eliza's arm, making sure she didn't drop Mercy. His touch was brief but gentle, and she found herself surprised by his consideration. Sorry about that, he said, pulling his hand back. Road gets rough out here after the rains. They passed a small creek where cattle stood drinking, their tails swishing at flies. The animals looked up as the wagon passed, chewing peacefully before returning to their business. Everything about this place felt different from town. Quieter, simpler, but also more dangerous in ways Eliza couldn't quite name. Do you have neighbors out here? She asked. Closest family is the Johnsons, about 3 miles north. Good people. Sarah Johnson helped me when I first arrived, taught me which plants were safe to eat and which ones would make you sick. Marcus glanced at her sideways. She's got a way with babies, too, if you ever need advice. The mention of other women nearby made Eliza feel slightly better. She'd been worried about being completely isolated with a man she didn't know, but having neighbors meant there were people who could help if things went wrong. As they crested a small hill, Marcus's homestead came into view. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She'd expected something rough and temporary, but what she saw was a solid log cabin with a stone chimney, surrounded by a well-tended vegetable garden and a sturdy barn. Wildflowers grew along the fence line, and everything looked cared for, loved even. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, unable to hide her amazement. "Most of it. Had help with the barn raising. Neighbors came from miles around for that." There was pride in his voice, the kind that came from creating something with your own hands. "The cabin was here when I bought the place, but I've made improvements. Added the porch, fixed the roof, built the chicken coop." As if summoned by his words, several chickens came running toward the wagon, clucking and flapping their wings. A large rooster strutted behind them, his chest puffed out importantly. "They're expecting their evening feed," Marcus explained, climbing down from the wagon. He walked around to Eliza's side and offered his hand to help her down. She hesitated for just a moment. Accepting his help felt like accepting this new life, this strange arrangement they'd made. But Mercy was getting heavy, and the wagon seat was higher than it looked. Marcus seemed to understand her hesitation. "I know this is all very sudden," he said quietly. "We can take things slow, figure out how to make this work for both of us." Eliza took his hand and let him help her down. His grip was strong but not demanding, steadying her without making her feel trapped. As her feet touched the ground, she felt a mix of relief and terror. This was her new home, whether she liked it or not. "The separate room I mentioned is through there," Marcus said, pointing to a door visible through the main cabin's windows. "It's got its own entrance, too, if you prefer privacy." He led her toward the cabin, the chickens following hopefully. The main room was larger than she'd expected, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. A table and chairs sat near the windows, and shelves lined the walls, filled with books, tools, and household items. Everything was clean and organized, but there was a loneliness to it that made her chest ache. "You read a lot," she observed, looking at the books. "Helps pass the winter evenings." Marcus opened the door to the side room and stepped back to let her look inside. The room was small but comfortable, with a bed covered in a colorful quilt, a small table, and a window that looked out over the garden. Someone had placed wildflowers in a jar on the table, and Eliza wondered if Marcus had done that for her arrival. "There's a cradle in the barn," he said. "I made it for. Well, I made it a while back. If you'd like, I can bring it in for Mercy." "You made a cradle?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Marcus's face darkened slightly. "I was engaged once, back in St. Louis. Things didn't work out the way I planned." "I'm sorry," Eliza said, and meant it. She could hear the pain in his voice, see it in the way his shoulders tensed when he mentioned his past. "We all have stories we'd rather not tell," he replied. "The important thing is figuring out how to move forward." Mercy chose that moment to start crying, her small voice filling the quiet room. Eliza began bouncing her gently, but the baby's cries only grew louder. "She's probably hungry," Eliza said, feeling embarrassed, "and tired from all the traveling." "Of course. I'll leave you to get settled." Marcus headed toward the door, then paused. "There's fresh milk in the cold cellar if you need it. And if you hear any strange noises tonight, don't worry, it's just the wind. Takes some getting used to out here." After he left, Eliza sat on the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning, she'd been preparing to sell herself at auction, desperate and hopeless. Now she was in a comfortable room, holding her fed and content daughter, with a man who seemed determined to treat her with respect. But she'd learned not to trust good things too quickly. Life had a way of taking away anything that made you happy, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not when Mercy's safety depended on her staying alert. Through the window, she could see Marcus feeding his chickens, talking to them like they were old friends. The sight made her smile despite her worries. Maybe, just maybe, this strange arrangement might actually work. 3 days into her new life, Eliza discovered that Marcus Reed was full of surprises. She'd expected him to make demands, to remind her constantly that he'd paid good money for her services. Instead, he seemed almost embarrassed by the whole arrangement. He left for his morning chores before she woke up, returning only when she called him for breakfast. During meals, he was polite but distant, asking about Mercy's health and whether Eliza needed anything from town. He never asked personal questions or made her feel like she owed him more than the cooking and cleaning they'd agreed upon. "More coffee?" Eliza asked on Thursday morning, holding up the pot. Please. Marcus didn't look up from the ledger he was studying, columns of numbers covering the open page. I'll be riding into town later. Need anything special? Eliza hesitated. She needed several things: soap, thread, warmer clothes for Mercy, but asking felt like admitting she was dependent on his charity. Just whatever you think is necessary. Marcus finally looked up, his dark eyes studying her face. That's not what I asked. I asked what you needed. I don't want to be a burden. Eliza. The way he said her name made her look at him directly. You're not a burden. You're working just as hard as I am, maybe harder with a baby to care for. If you need something, tell me. The kindness in his voice almost broke her composure. She'd gotten used to being treated like an inconvenience, a problem to be solved or ignored. Having someone actually care about her needs felt foreign and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Mercy's growing fast, she said finally. She'll need warmer clothes soon, and I could use some thread if there's any available. Of course. Anything else? Eliza shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. Marcus nodded and returned to his ledger, but she caught him glancing at her several more times during breakfast. After he left for town, Eliza threw herself into housework with an energy born of nervous excitement. She scrubbed the already clean floors, organized the already neat shelves, and baked enough bread to feed a small army. Mercy watched from her cradle. Marcus had indeed brought it in, and it was the most beautiful piece of baby furniture Eliza had ever seen, carved with tiny flowers and birds. Around noon, she heard hoofbeats approaching, but instead of Marcus's familiar horse, 3 riders she didn't recognize were heading toward the cabin. Eliza's heart began to race as she watched them through the window. The men dismounted near the porch, their movements casual but alert. They wore the kind of clothes that suggested they worked with cattle, but something about them made Eliza uneasy. Maybe it was the way their eyes constantly scanned the area, or how their hands never moved far from their gun belts. "Hello, the house," one of them called out. "Anyone home?" Eliza picked up Mercy and moved away from the window. She had no idea who these men were or what they wanted, but Marcus wasn't here to protect them. She thought about the rifle she'd seen hanging over the fireplace, but she'd never fired a gun in her life. "We know someone's in there," a different voice said. "Saw smoke from the chimney." After a long moment, Eliza opened the door just wide enough to look out. "Can I help you?" The 3 men exchanged glances. The one who seemed to be their leader was tall and thin, with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, well," he said. "You must be Reed's new woman. Heard he bought himself some company at the auction." Eliza's cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Reed isn't here right now. If you have business with him, you'll need to come back later." "Actually, our business might be with you," the man said, stepping closer to the porch. "Name's Jake Hutchins. Bill Hutchins is my brother." The name hit Eliza like a physical blow. Bill Hutchins had been the auctioneer, the man who'd sold her like a piece of livestock. This must be his brother, which meant he knew exactly how she'd ended up here. "What do you want?" she asked, instinctively stepping back. "Just wanted to meet the famous Eliza Hartwell," Jake said. "Word is, you might be worth more than Reed paid for you." "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do. Pretty young widow with a sad story? There are men in Denver who'd pay good money for that kind of companionship. Better money than what you'll get scrubbing floors and cooking beans." Eliza felt sick. These men weren't here to visit or conduct business. They were here to take her, to sell her again to someone else. "I'm not interested." "Now, don't be hasty," Jake said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "You haven't even heard our offer." I said no. Eliza tried to close the door, but one of the other men had already stepped onto the porch. "See, that's the thing about your situation," Jake continued. "You don't really have the right to say no. Reed bought you fair and square, but there's nothing stopping someone else from making him a better offer." Mercy began to cry, sensing her mother's fear. The sound seemed to amuse the men, which made Eliza's terror spike even higher. "Please," she said, "just leave us alone." "Can't do that, sweetheart. Business is business." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made everyone freeze. Through the dust kicked up by the strangers' horses, Eliza could see Marcus riding hard toward the cabin. His face was set in lines she'd never seen before, and there was something in his posture that spoke of barely controlled rage. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, as he dismounted, his voice calm despite the fire in his eyes, "I believe you're on my property without permission." Jake Hutchins smiled, but it was the kind of smile that preceded violence. "Just having a friendly conversation with your woman, Reed. Nothing wrong with being neighborly." "Neighborly would have been waiting for me to return," Marcus replied. "This feels more like trespassing." "Now, Reed, let's not get all worked up over nothing. We were just explaining to the lady that she might have other opportunities available to her." Marcus's hand moved to rest on his gun belt, a gesture so casual it almost seemed accidental. "The lady has already made her choice. I suggest you respect that." "You sure you want to make this difficult?" Jake asked. 3 against 1 doesn't usually end well for the one. "You're right," Marcus said. "But you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" Marcus smiled, and it was colder than any expression Eliza had ever seen. "This is my land. I know every rock, every tree, every hiding spot for miles around. You're strangers here, which means you're at a disadvantage." The 3 men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that they were far from help if things went wrong. "Besides," Marcus continued, "the lady isn't property to be bought and sold anymore. She's under my protection now, and I take that responsibility seriously." Jake Hutchins stared at Marcus for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he stepped back toward his horse. "This isn't over, Reed. Word's going to get around about what you've got here. Other people might not be as polite as we've been." "Let them come," Marcus said simply. After the men rode away, Eliza sank onto the porch steps, her legs too shaky to support her anymore. Mercy had stopped crying, but she clung to her mother with tiny fists wrapped in Eliza's dress. Marcus approached slowly, his expression gentling as he saw her distress. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "No," Eliza managed. They wanted to take me somewhere else. Said there were men in Denver who'd pay more for me than you did." Marcus's jaw tightened again. "That's not going to happen. I meant what I said about protection." "Why?" The question burst out of her before she could stop it. "Why would you risk your life for someone you barely know?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out over his land. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "Because everyone deserves to choose their own life, and because I've seen what happens when good people don't stand up for each other." As they sat together on the porch, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, Eliza realized that her new life was going to be more complicated than she'd imagined. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, but would end with everything changed. Marcus rode back from town with supplies and mail, his face grim as storm clouds. Eliza was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, Mercy playing happily in a basket at her feet, when she noticed his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, dropping the wet shirt she'd been pinning up. Marcus dismounted slowly, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. His hands shook slightly as he held it out to her. "This came for you, from St. Louis." Eliza's blood turned to ice. Nobody in St. Louis should know where she was. She'd been so careful to leave no trace when she fled with Mercy, telling nobody her plans or destination. The envelope was addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize, but the return address made her stomach drop. "Whitfield Estate Legal Services," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Your husband's family?" Marcus asked gently. Eliza nodded, unable to speak. Jonathan's family had never liked her, believing she wasn't good enough for their precious son. They'd made their feelings clear at the wedding and even clearer after the funeral, when they'd tried to claim Jonathan's few possessions. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of expensive paper. As she read, her face went pale as winter snow. "They're saying I might have been involved in Jonathan's death," she whispered. "That I left town too quickly after the funeral. That people are asking questions about the mine explosion." Marcus took the letter and read it himself, his expression darkening with each line. "This is nonsense. Your husband died in an accident with 11 other men. How could you possibly be responsible for that?" Jonathan had been asking questions about safety at the mine. He thought the owners were cutting corners, putting workers at risk to save money. Eliza picked up Mercy, needing the comfort of her daughter's warm weight. After he died, his notes and letters disappeared from our house. Someone broke in while I was at the funeral. You think the mine owners took them? I don't know what to think anymore. Eliza's voice cracked. All I know is that people started whispering after that, saying maybe I'd been paid to keep quiet about Jonathan's investigations, saying maybe I'd helped cover up evidence. Marcus folded the letter carefully, his movements controlled despite the anger she could see building in his eyes. Even if that were true, which it isn't, what would they want with you now? It's been almost a year. The letter says new evidence has come to light. Someone claims they saw me meeting with mine officials before Jonathan died. Eliza felt tears starting to fall. It's not true, Marcus. I swear to you, I never met with anyone. I never took money from them. I loved my husband. I believe you, Marcus said immediately. But what does this lawyer want? Eliza read the letter again, her hands shaking. He wants to know my current whereabouts. Says if I don't respond within 30 days, they'll assume I'm hiding something and contact the authorities. They stood in silence for several minutes, the cheerful morning sounds of birds and chickens suddenly seeming far away. Mercy babbled happily in her mother's arms, unaware that their carefully built new life was crumbling around them. We need to think about this carefully, Marcus said finally. If you go back to face these accusations, you might be walking into a trap. But if you don't respond, I look guilty either way. Eliza wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Oh God, Marcus, what if they're right? What if running away made me look like I had something to hide? You didn't run away. You left because you had no money and a baby to feed. That's not the same thing. But even as he said it, Eliza could see doubt creeping into his expression. Not doubt about her innocence, but doubt about whether anyone else would see it that way. A young widow fleeing town shortly after her husband's suspicious death would raise questions, especially if powerful people wanted those questions raised. There's something else, Eliza said quietly. Something I haven't told you about the night before Jonathan died. Marcus waited, his face carefully neutral. He came home drunk and angry, angrier than I'd ever seen him. He started saying terrible things about the baby, about whether she was really his. The words came out in a rush, like poison she'd been holding inside. He hit me, Marcus. Hard enough that I fell down. I was 7 months pregnant, and my own husband hit me. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained gentle. What did you do? I locked myself in the bedroom and stayed there until he passed out. The next morning, he was sober and ashamed. He apologized, said he'd been under too much pressure, promised it would never happen again. Eliza's voice broke, but I could see in his eyes that something had changed, that maybe it would happen again. And then he died that afternoon. And I felt guilty for being relieved, Eliza whispered. I felt guilty because part of me was glad I wouldn't have to find out if he'd keep his promise. Marcus stepped closer, his voice urgent. Listen to me. None of that makes you responsible for his death. None of it makes you a murderer. You were a scared, pregnant woman trapped in a bad situation. But what if the lawyer finds out about that night? What if someone saw the bruises? It would look like I had a reason to want Jonathan dead. Before Marcus could answer, they heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple horses, moving fast. Eliza's heart began to race as she recognized the sound. It was exactly like the day Jake Hutchins and his men had come calling. Get inside, Marcus said, his hand moving to his gun. Take Mercy, and lock the door. But as the riders came into view, Eliza realized with relief that these weren't strangers. It was Sarah Johnson and her husband Tom, their faces grim with urgency. Marcus, Tom called out as he dismounted. We need to talk. There are men in town asking questions about Eliza. Sarah hurried toward them, her motherly face creased with worry. 3 strangers rode in this morning, well-dressed city types. They're showing around a photograph and asking if anyone's seen a woman matching Eliza's description. What kind of men? Marcus asked. The kind that work for lawyers or wealthy families, Tom replied. The kind that get paid to find people who don't want to be found. Eliza felt the world tilting beneath her feet. The letter hadn't been a warning. It had been a distraction. While she was reading threats about what might happen if she didn't respond, the real hunters were already closing in. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked. "They were still at the hotel when we left, but they'll probably start riding out to the homesteads this afternoon," Sarah said. "Marcus, if they find her here." "They won't," Marcus said firmly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." But Eliza could see the fear in his eyes, and she knew that this time, good intentions and righteous anger might not be enough to protect them. The old mine shaft was hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees 3 miles from Marcus's cabin, its entrance barely visible beneath years of fallen branches and prairie grass. Marcus had discovered it during his first winter, using it to store supplies when the weather turned dangerous. Now it would serve as Eliza's hiding place while they figured out their next move. "I don't like this," Eliza said as Marcus helped her down into the narrow space. The shaft was deeper than it looked, carved into solid rock by some long-gone prospector who'd given up hope of finding silver. "What if something happens to you while I'm down here?" "Nothing's going to happen to me," Marcus replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sarah and Tom are keeping watch on the town. If those men start heading this way, we'll know about it." The hiding place was more comfortable than Eliza had expected. Marcus had lined the walls with boards and added a small wood stove that vented through a crack in the rocks. There were blankets, food supplies, and even a few books to pass the time. It was clear he'd prepared this place for emergencies, though she doubted he'd ever imagined hiding a woman and baby from hired investigators. "How long can we stay here?" she asked, settling Mercy into a makeshift cradle Marcus had fashioned from a wooden crate. "As long as it takes. These city men won't want to spend weeks searching every homestead in Kansas territory. If we can wait them out, they'll probably give up and report back that you can't be found." But even as he said it, Eliza could see the doubt in his eyes. Men hired by wealthy families didn't give up easily, especially when their reputations depended on success. If they'd come this far to find her, they wouldn't leave empty-handed. "Marcus," she said quietly, "maybe it would be better if I turned myself in, faced whatever accusations they have, and tried to clear my name." "With what evidence? You said yourself that Jonathan's papers disappeared. It would be your word against theirs, and they have money and influence." Marcus checked his pocket watch. "I need to get back to the cabin before those men arrive. If they find it empty, they might get suspicious." "What will you tell them?" "That I live alone and always have. That I've never heard of anyone named Eliza Hartwell." Marcus climbed toward the entrance, then paused. "Whatever happens, don't come out until you hear the signal we agreed on. 3 short whistles, then 2 long ones." After he left, Eliza found herself alone with Mercy in the dim underground space. The baby was fascinated by the unusual surroundings, her eyes wide as she took in the flickering shadows cast by the small oil lamp. For someone so young, she seemed remarkably adaptable to their constantly changing circumstances. "What are we going to do, little one?" Eliza whispered, stroking Mercy's soft hair. "How did we end up hiding in a hole in the ground, like criminals?" Time moved strangely in the mine shaft. Without windows or natural light, Eliza found it impossible to judge whether minutes or hours were passing. She tried to read one of Marcus's books, but her mind kept wandering to what might be happening above ground. Were the investigators at the cabin now? Was Marcus managing to convince them he knew nothing about her? Sometime later, it felt like hours, but might have been less. She heard voices approaching through the trees above. Her heart began to race as she recognized Marcus's voice mixed with others she didn't know. The men were close enough that their words carried clearly down into the shaft. "Like I told you, gentlemen, I live alone out here," Marcus was saying. "Have ever since I arrived from St. Louis. If there was a woman with a baby on my property, don't you think I'd know about it? We have reliable information that Eliza Hartwell was seen in Millbrook around the time you made a large purchase at the town auction," came an unfamiliar voice with an Eastern accent. "Surely you remember buying something that expensive." Eliza held her breath. They knew about the auction. Somehow, they'd traced her movements right to the moment Marcus had bid on her. "I bought a horse that day," Marcus replied smoothly. "Big brown mare. Cost me more than I wanted to spend, but she's proven worth every penny." "A horse," the stranger repeated, skepticism clear in his tone. "That's right. You can check with Bill Hutchins if you don't believe me. He ran the auction." There was a long pause, and Eliza could imagine the investigators exchanging glances, trying to decide whether Marcus was telling the truth. The lie was brilliant in its simplicity, close enough to the truth that it would be hard to disprove, but different enough to protect her. "Mind if we look around your property?" another voice asked. "Help yourselves," Marcus replied, "though I'm not sure what you expect to find. Like I said, it's just me and the animals out here." Eliza listened to footsteps moving around above, the men conducting a thorough search of the cabin and surrounding buildings. At one point, someone walked directly over the hidden entrance to the mine shaft, their boots crunching on the fallen leaves that concealed the opening. Mercy began to fuss, her small sounds seeming impossibly loud in the confined space. Eliza quickly put her daughter to her breast, praying the baby would settle before her cries attracted attention. The sounds above continued for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the voices moved away from the mine shaft area. Eliza could hear them discussing their search, frustration evident in their tones. They'd found no evidence of a woman or baby, no signs that anyone other than Marcus lived on the property. "We'll be back," one of them warned, "if we find out you've been lying to us." "You won't," Marcus replied confidently. "Because I'm not." The sound of horses departing filled Eliza with relief so intense she felt dizzy, but she forced herself to wait, counting slowly to 1,000 before allowing herself to hope they were really gone. When Marcus's signal finally came, 3 short whistles followed by 2 long ones, Eliza nearly wept with gratitude. She gathered Mercy and their few supplies, climbing carefully toward the surface. Marcus was waiting for her, his face pale but triumphant. "They're gone. For now." "They knew about the auction," Eliza said as he helped her out of the shaft. "How could they possibly know about that?" "Someone talked. Maybe Bill Hutchins. Maybe someone else who was there that day." Marcus's expression was grim. "The point is, they're not giving up. They'll be back with more men, better information. Then I need to leave. Tonight. If I'm not here, you'll be safe." "Where would you go?" "They're watching the roads, checking every town between here and St. Louis." Marcus took her hands in his grip warm and steady. "Running won't solve this, Eliza. It'll just prove to them that you have something to hide. Then what do you suggest?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he worked through possibilities. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with determination. "We fight back. Find out who's really behind these accusations, and why they want you so badly. Someone's going to a lot of trouble and expense to destroy your life, and that means they have something to gain from it." Eliza looked at this man who'd already risked so much for her, who was now proposing to risk even more. "Why would you do that? Why would you put yourself in danger for someone you barely know?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time since the investigators had arrived, he looked truly confident. "Because I'm starting to think I know you better than I realized. And because fighting back is better than spending the rest of our lives hiding in holes." As they walked back toward the cabin, Mercy sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced in months, hope mixed with determination. Maybe it was time to stop running and start fighting for the life she wanted to build. The winter storm hit Kansas territory like God's own fury, turning the world into a spinning nightmare of snow and wind that made breathing feel like drowning. Eliza woke to Mercy's terrified screams cutting through the howling darkness, her baby's tiny body burning with fever that seemed to come from the fires of hell itself. "Marcus!" Eliza's voice cracked with panic as she lifted Mercy from the cradle. The baby's skin was hot enough to cook eggs on, and her breathing came in short, desperate gasps that sounded like death knocking at their door. Marcus appeared in the doorway within seconds, his hair wild from sleep, but his eyes instantly sharp with alertness. One look at Mercy told him everything he needed to know. They were fighting for the baby's life now. "We need Doc Morrison," he said, already reaching for his clothes scattered on the floor. "In this storm, Eliza looked toward the windows where snow fell so thick it erased the world beyond their glass. The wind screamed against the cabin walls like something alive and hungry. "We'll freeze to death before we make it half a mile. Then we'll die trying," Marcus said, pulling on his boots with movements that spoke of absolute determination. "Because staying here means watching her die for certain." The decision to brave the storm was madness, but it was the only madness that offered hope. Marcus hitched the horses to the wagon with hands that shook from cold and fear, while Eliza wrapped Mercy in every blanket they owned. The baby had stopped crying, which somehow felt worse than her earlier screams. "Hold on tight," Marcus shouted over the wind as they climbed into the wagon. "Don't let go of her, no matter what happens." The journey became a battle against nature herself. Wind tried to tear them from the wagon seat, snow blinded them until they couldn't see the horses' heads, and cold bit through their clothes like hungry wolves. Twice the wagon wheels hit hidden ice and sent them sliding toward disaster, only Marcus's strength and skill keeping them upright. Halfway to town, the inevitable happened. The front wheels struck a boulder hidden beneath the snow and cracked with a sound like breaking bones. The wagon lurched sideways, throwing them into a snowbank that felt soft as pillows but cold as death. "What now?" Eliza gasped, struggling to keep Mercy warm while snow swirled around them like angry spirits. Marcus was already unhitching the horses, his movements quick despite the storm trying to knock him down. "We ride. Both horses. You and Mercy on one, me on the other." "I can't ride in this weather, not while holding a baby." "You can," Marcus said, his voice cutting through her fear like a blade through silk. "You can because you have to. Because she needs you to be stronger than you've ever been." He lifted Eliza onto the gentler of the two horses, then climbed up behind her, his arms creating a protective circle around both mother and child. The second horse followed behind them, connected by a lead rope that Marcus gripped with determination that refused to consider failure. The ride to town tested every limit of human endurance. Eliza's arms ached from holding Mercy, her face went numb from cold, and her legs cramped from gripping the horse's sides. But she held on because Marcus believed she could, and because her daughter's life depended on reaching help before it was too late. When Doc Morrison's office finally appeared through the snow like a miracle made of wood and lamplight, Eliza nearly sobbed with relief. They stumbled through the door like survivors of a shipwreck, snow melting off their clothes in puddles that spoke of their desperate journey. Doc Morrison took one look at Mercy, and his weathered face went grim. "Pneumonia," he said after a quick examination. "In a baby this young, it's about as serious gets." "What can you do?" Eliza asked, though her voice sounded like it came from someone else's throat. "Keep her warm, keep her breathing. Pray harder than you've ever prayed in your life." The doctor's honesty was brutal but necessary. "It's going to be a long night, and I won't lie to you. Some babies don't make it through something like this." The hours that followed tested Eliza's faith in ways she'd never imagined. She held Mercy against her chest, sharing every bit of warmth her body could provide, while Marcus fed the fire and Doc Morrison monitored their daughter's fragile breathing. They took turns sleeping, but it was the kind of sleep that came from exhaustion rather than peace. Around dawn, when hope felt as distant as spring in January, Mercy's fever finally broke. Her breathing steadied, her color improved, and she opened her eyes to look at her mother with recognition and love. "She's going to make it," Doc Morrison said, and the relief in his voice matched what Eliza felt in her heart. But as she sat holding her recovered daughter, watching the storm finally ease outside the window, Eliza realized something had changed during those terrible hours. She'd seen how far Marcus would go to protect them, how he'd risk everything without hesitation when their lives were threatened. And she'd felt her own love for him growing stronger with each mile they'd traveled through that hellish storm. "Thank you," she whispered to Marcus as he sat beside her, both of them exhausted but grateful beyond words. "For what?" "For believing we could make it. For not giving up when everything seemed impossible." Marcus looked at her with eyes that held depths she was only beginning to understand. "I couldn't give up. Not on you. Not on her. Not on what we're building together." And in that moment, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that she loved this man who'd saved her in more ways than she could count. Spring exploded across the Kansas prairie like a celebration of life itself, painting the endless grassland with wildflowers that made the world look like God's own garden. Eliza found herself humming as she worked in Marcus's vegetable garden, Mercy playing contentedly in a basket nearby, watching butterflies dance among the bean plants. 3 months had passed since the nightmare journey through the winter storm, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be true. The investigators from St. Louis hadn't returned, Marcus's crops were thriving, and Mercy had grown into a happy, healthy baby who seemed to find joy in everything, from sunrise to the sound of Marcus's voice. "I've been thinking," Marcus said one evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that had no names, "about making some changes around here." Eliza looked up from the mending in her lap, noting something different in his tone. "What kind of changes?" "Well, for starters, I think this arrangement we have could use some adjustments." Marcus was carving a wooden toy for Mercy, but his hands moved with unusual nervousness. "I mean, the way things are now, it's not exactly what either of us planned." Eliza's heart began to beat faster. Was he preparing to tell her she needed to leave? Had she misread the signals between them, mistaken kindness for something deeper? "I see," she said carefully, not trusting herself to say more. Marcus set down his carving and looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious but warm. "Eliza, what I'm trying to say is that I've fallen in love with you, with both of you. And I hope that maybe you feel the same way." The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Eliza felt her breath catch in her throat, joy and fear warring in her chest. "I do," she whispered. "I love you too, Marcus. More than I thought possible." "Then marry me," he said, reaching into his pocket to pull out a simple gold ring. "Not because of some arrangement or convenience, but because I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy." The ring was beautiful in its simplicity, a band of gold that caught the sunset light and seemed to hold promises of forever. But even as Eliza reached for it, a shadow of doubt crossed her mind. What about my past? What about the accusations and the investigators? What if they come back? "Then we'll face them together," Marcus said firmly, "as husband and wife, as a family." Before Eliza could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the perfect moment. But this time, the rider was Sarah Johnson, and her face carried news that would change everything. "Marcus, Eliza," Sarah called out as she dismounted, "you need to hear this. I just came from town, and there's been news from St. Louis." "What kind of news?" Marcus asked, instinctively moving closer to Eliza. "The mine company that employed Jonathan has been investigated by federal authorities. Turns out they were cutting safety corners to increase profits, just like Jonathan suspected. 12 men died because of their greed, and now the truth is finally coming out." Eliza felt the world shift beneath her feet. "What does that mean for me?" "It means the accusations against you were lies from the beginning," Sarah said, her voice filled with righteous anger. "The mine owners needed someone to blame for Jonathan's death, someone to make people forget about their safety violations. They picked you because you were vulnerable, a poor widow with no family to defend her. But why would they go to such lengths to find me now?" Sarah's expression grew even more serious. "Because Jonathan's papers didn't disappear. Someone saved them, his supervisor at the mine, a man named Thomas Grant. He's been carrying them around for a year, too scared to come forward because he knew what the mine owners were capable of. And now he's talking? Now he's dead," Sarah said bluntly. "Found shot in an alley 3 weeks ago. But before he died, he gave the papers to a newspaper reporter who's been investigating the mine company. The whole story is about to come out, and the mine owners are desperate to find anyone who might have more evidence." Marcus stood up slowly, his hand moving to his gun belt. "They think Eliza might have copies of Jonathan's notes." "That's exactly what they think, and they're willing to kill to make sure those papers never see daylight." The implications hit Eliza like physical blows. The investigators who'd come looking for her weren't trying to solve a crime. They were trying to cover one up. They wanted to silence her permanently, to make sure she could never testify about what Jonathan had discovered. "We need to leave," she said, standing up so quickly that Mercy started crying in her basket. "Tonight, if they're willing to kill Thomas Grant, they won't hesitate to kill us." "Running won't solve this," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Where would we go? How would we live?" "I don't know, but staying here means putting you in danger, and I won't do that." Eliza picked up Mercy, her mind already racing through possibilities. "I've brought enough trouble into your life." "Stop," Marcus said firmly. "You haven't brought trouble. Trouble followed you here. There's a difference." Sarah stepped forward, her motherly face set with determination. "There might be another way. The reporter investigating the mine company, his name is David Walsh, and he's looking for witnesses. People who can testify about what really happened. You think I should contact him? I think your testimony, combined with Jonathan's papers, might be enough to bring down the people who've been trying to destroy your life." Sarah's eyes were bright with possibility. "Instead of running from the truth, maybe it's time to use it as a weapon." Marcus nodded slowly. "Sarah's right. These people have been hunting you because they're afraid of what you might know. Maybe it's time to give them something real to be afraid of." As they sat on the porch discussing their options, Eliza realized that the peaceful life she'd found here was about to end. But maybe, just maybe, they could build something even better on the other side of this fight. The ring Marcus had offered still caught the last light of sunset, a promise of the future they might have if they were brave enough to fight for it. And looking at this man who'd risked everything for her, holding their daughter who represented hope itself, Eliza felt her fear transform into something stronger. It was time to stop running and start fighting back. The telegram that changed everything arrived with the morning supply wagon, its urgent message crackling with danger that made Marcus's hands shake as he read it aloud. "Walsh, murdered, stop. Paper stolen, stop. They know where you are. Stop, run now, stop." Eliza felt her blood turn to ice water as the words sank in. David Walsh, the reporter who was supposed to help them expose the truth, was dead. The evidence that could have cleared her name was gone. And somehow, impossibly, the mine company killers had tracked them down to their peaceful Kansas homestead. "How much time do we have?" she asked, already moving toward the cabin to gather their few precious belongings. "Not much," Marcus replied, scanning the horizon for signs of approaching riders. "If they sent this telegram, they're probably already on their way here." The next hour passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Marcus loaded their wagon with supplies, while Eliza packed everything Mercy would need for a long journey. They moved with the efficiency of people who'd learned that survival sometimes depended on how quickly you could abandon everything you'd built. "Where are we going?" Eliza asked as Marcus hitched their fastest horses to the wagon. "North to Nebraska, then west to Colorado Territory. My brother has a ranch near Denver. He'll help us disappear until we can figure out our next move." Marcus's face was grim with determination. "These killers might have money and influence, but they don't know the country like we do." As they prepared to leave, Sarah Johnson rode up with news that made their situation even more desperate. "There are 8 men heading this way from town," she said, her horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. "Professional types, armed and asking questions about a woman with a baby." 8 men, Marcus repeated, his hand instinctively moving to check his rifle. "That's not a search party. That's an execution squad." "They split up about 2 miles back," Sarah continued. 4 are coming up the main road. 4 more are circling around to cut off the back trail. They know exactly how to trap someone out here. Eliza's heart sank as she realized they'd waited too long to run. The killers had planned this perfectly, using the same hunting tactics that worked on deer and elk. By the time you saw them coming from one direction, others were already in position to finish you off. "The mine shaft," Marcus said suddenly. "If we can get there before they spot us, we might have a chance." "You want to hide in a hole in the ground with a baby while 8 armed men search for us?" Eliza's voice cracked with disbelief. "I want to use the shaft as a base while I pick them off one by one," Marcus replied, his tone taking on the cold efficiency of a man who'd decided that killing was better than dying. "They might have numbers, but I know every rock and tree for miles around." The ride to the hidden mine shaft became a race against death itself. Marcus pushed their horses harder than was safe, while Eliza clutched Mercy and tried to keep them both from being thrown from the bouncing wagon. Behind them, dust clouds on the horizon marked the approach of their hunters. They reached the concealed entrance just as the first riders appeared in the distance. Marcus helped Eliza and Mercy down into the familiar underground chamber, then grabbed his rifle and a box of ammunition. "Whatever happens," he said, looking into her eyes with fierce intensity, "don't come out until you hear my voice calling the all clear. Not for gunshots, not for screaming, not for anything else." Marcus, wait. But he was already gone, disappearing into the cottonwood grove like a ghost bent on revenge. Eliza found herself alone in the dim underground space, holding Mercy close, while the sound of approaching horses grew louder overhead. The first gunshot cracked across the prairie like thunder, followed by shouting and the sound of horses crashing through underbrush. Marcus had made contact with the hunters, and the deadly game of hide-and-seek had begun. From her hiding place, Eliza could hear the battle developing above. More gunshots echoed through the trees, punctuated by men's voices calling out positions and orders. These weren't random drifters or cattle rustlers. They moved and fought with the discipline of soldiers or professional killers. "Spread out!" someone shouted. "He can't watch all directions at once." "Johnson's down," came another voice. "Son of a bitch got Johnson." Despite her terror, Eliza felt a fierce pride in Marcus's skill. He was fighting for their lives with everything he had, using his knowledge of the land to even the odds against superior numbers. But as the gunfight continued, she began to worry about ammunition. Marcus was only one man with limited supplies, while the hunters probably carried enough firepower to fight a small war. How long could he hold them off? A new sound made her blood freeze. Mercy was starting to fuss, her small voice threatening to grow into the kind of cry that would carry clearly in the underground chamber. If the baby started screaming now, it would lead the killers straight to their hiding place. Eliza began humming softly, rocking Mercy, in a desperate attempt to keep her calm. The baby's eyes were wide with confusion at the strange sounds echoing from above, but she seemed to respond to her mother's gentle movements. The gunfire suddenly stopped, leaving in silence that felt more terrifying than the battle itself. Had Marcus won? Had he been killed? Eliza strained her ears, trying to make sense of the muffled voices filtering down through the earth. "Reed!" a voice called out, loud enough to carry across the entire area. "We know you're out there, and we know you've got the woman and the baby somewhere nearby." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. They knew she was here. All their hiding and running had been for nothing. "Here's how this is going to work," the voice continued. "You come out with your hands up, and we'll make this quick and clean. Keep fighting, and we'll make sure the woman and baby suffer before they die." The threat hung in the air like poison, and Eliza found herself praying harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. Not for her own safety, but for Marcus to be smart enough to stay hidden. These men would kill him the moment he showed himself, and then they'd hunt down her and Mercy at their leisure. But she knew Marcus well enough to understand that he'd never abandon them, even if it meant his own death. He was probably out there right now, weighing the impossible choice between surrender and continued resistance. The sound of footsteps directly overhead made her freeze. Someone was walking across the concealed entrance to the mine shaft, so close she could hear their breathing. If they discovered the hidden opening, the game would be over. Mercy chose that exact moment to let out a small cry. The footsteps above stopped immediately, and Eliza held her breath so long she thought her lungs might burst. Through the thin layer of branches and earth that concealed the mine shaft entrance, she could hear someone breathing hard, like a hunting dog that had caught an interesting scent. "Did you hear that?" a gruff voice asked. "Hear what?" came the reply from further away. "Sounded like a baby crying." Eliza pressed her hand gently over Mercy's mouth, not to hurt her but to muffle any further sounds. Her daughter's eyes went wide with confusion, but she didn't struggle against her mother's touch. "You're hearing things, Parker," the second voice said. "Come on, Reed's probably circling around to get behind us." The footsteps moved away, but Eliza knew they'd return. These men were too thorough, too professional to ignore even the smallest clue. It was only a matter of time before they found the shaft entrance. From somewhere in the distance came Marcus's voice, strong and defiant. "You want me? Come and get me, but you'll have to earn it." His challenge was followed by another gunshot, then the sound of men running through the underbrush. Marcus was drawing them away from the mine shaft, using himself as bait to protect her and Mercy. The thought of him sacrificing himself for them made her heart break and soar at the same time. The battle resumed with renewed fury. Gunshots echoed across the prairie as Marcus played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the hired killers. From the sounds above, she could tell he was moving constantly, never staying in one position long enough for them to pin him down. "There he is," someone shouted, "behind that big cottonwood." More gunfire erupted, followed by the crash of someone falling heavily through tree branches. Eliza's blood turned cold. Had they hit Marcus? Was he lying wounded or dead while she cowered in this hole like a frightened rabbit? But then she heard his voice again, more distant now but still strong. "Missed me, boys. Want to try again?" The relief was so intense she nearly sobbed. Marcus was still alive, still fighting, still protecting them with everything he had. But she could hear the exhaustion creeping into his voice, and she knew he couldn't keep this up forever. Minutes crawled by like hours as the gun battle raged above. Eliza counted at least 6 different voices among the hunters, which meant Marcus had already taken down 2 of them. But 6 against 1 were still impossible odds, especially when the one was running low on ammunition. A new sound made her freeze. Someone was arguing in harsh whispers, directly above the mineshaft entrance. They'd come back, and this time they were being more careful about their search. "I'm telling you, I heard a baby," the gruff voice insisted. "Right around here somewhere." "Then where is it? Babies don't just disappear into thin air. Maybe there's a cave or something. You know how this country is, full of holes and hiding places." Eliza felt her world shrinking to the size of a prayer. They were going to find the entrance. All their careful concealment, all of Marcus's fighting, all of it would be for nothing if these men looked hard enough. The sound of boots scraping against wood made her heart stop. Someone was clearing away the branches that hid the shaft opening. Inch by inch, the carefully hidden entrance was being exposed. "Well, well," the gruff voice said with satisfaction. "Look what we have here." Light suddenly poured down into the mine shaft as the concealment was stripped away. Eliza found herself staring up at 2 men with guns, pointed directly at her. Their faces were hard and professional, showing no emotion at finding a terrified woman hiding with her baby. "Come on up, sweetheart," one of them said. "Nice and slow, and don't even think about trying anything clever." Eliza climbed slowly out of the shaft. Mercy clutched protectively against her chest. The 2 men stepped back to give her room, but their weapons never wavered from their targets. "Well, well," the second man said, "the famous Eliza Hartwell. You've led us quite a chase, lady." "Please," Eliza said, her voice shaking. "My daughter hasn't done anything wrong. Let her go." "Sorry, but that's not how this works," the first man replied. "You both know too much, and our employers don't like loose ends." The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of more killers. 4 additional men emerged from the trees, their faces grim with professional satisfaction. In the distance, the gunfire had stopped, leaving an ominous silence. "Where's Reed?" one of the newcomers asked. "Dead or wounded somewhere in those trees," came the reply. "Stopped shooting about 5 minutes ago." The words hit Eliza like physical blows. Marcus might be dead, killed while trying to protect them. The thought of him lying bleeding and alone in the prairie grass made her want to scream. "What about the papers?" another man asked. "Did Reed have them?" "Doesn't matter," the leader said. "With Walsh dead and these 2 about to join him, there won't be anyone left to cause trouble." But even as he spoke, a new sound echoed across the prairie, the distant rumble of many horses approaching fast. The killers exchanged glances, clearly not expecting company. "Who the hell is that?" someone demanded. The answer came in the form of Tom Johnson's voice, carrying clearly across the open ground. "This is the Kansas Territorial Militia. You men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons." Eliza's heart leaped with hope. Sarah must have ridden for help. bringing back enough armed men to turn the tables on the killers. The hunters were now the hunted. "How many?" the leader hissed. "Looks like 20 or more," someone replied after peering through the trees. The killers found themselves facing an impossible choice: surrender to territorial authorities who would ask uncomfortable questions, or fight a battle they couldn't win against overwhelming odds. "We're leaving," the leader decided. "Now, what about the woman and baby?" The man looked at Eliza with cold calculation, and she saw her death in his eyes. "Can't leave witnesses." But before he could raise his weapon, a rifle shot cracked from the trees, and the leader pitched forward with a surprised expression. Marcus Reed stepped out from behind a massive cottonwood, his rifle smoking and his face set in lines of absolute determination. "I wouldn't," he said quietly, as the remaining killers spun toward him. The next few seconds erupted into chaos as the militia charged into the clearing, guns blazing. The professional killers, caught between Marcus's position and the approaching lawmen, found themselves with nowhere to run. When the shooting stopped, 5 of the 8 killers lay dead, and the remaining 3 had thrown down their weapons in surrender. Marcus was wounded in the shoulder but alive, and the nightmare that had followed them from St. Louis was finally over. As Eliza ran to Marcus's side, Mercy babbling happily in her arms, she realized that sometimes the only way to find peace was to fight for it with everything you had. And looking at this man who'd risked his life for them again and again, she knew they'd found something worth fighting for. The courthouse in Topeka buzzed with tension as lawyers shuffled papers and whispered urgent strategies. But all eyes were on the woman sitting in the witness chair, whose testimony would either destroy a mining empire or send her to prison for murder. Eliza Hartwell faced the packed courtroom with her chin raised high, knowing that everything she'd fought for hung on the words she was about to speak. "Mrs. Hartwell," the prosecutor began, his voice carrying across the silent room, "please tell the court exactly what your husband Jonathan discovered about the Whitfield Mining Company's safety practices." The question she'd dreaded for months had finally arrived. Eliza glanced toward the gallery where Marcus sat with Mercy in his arms, his encouraging nod giving her the strength to begin. The wound in his shoulder had healed, but the love in his eyes remained as strong as the day he'd risked everything to save them. "Jonathan came home from the mine 3 weeks before he died," Eliza said, her voice clear despite the hammering of her heart. "He was carrying a notebook filled with measurements and observations. He said the company was using inferior timber supports to save money, and that gas pockets weren't being properly vented." The defense attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit paid for by mining money, jumped to his feet. "Objection! This is hearsay evidence from a woman who has every reason to lie." "Overruled," Judge Morrison said firmly. "The witness may continue." Eliza took a deep breath and pressed on. "Jonathan showed me copies of letters he'd written to the company supervisors, warning them about dangerous conditions. They ignored every single warning. He said 12 men were going to die if something wasn't done." A murmur went through the courtroom. The families of the other miners who died in the explosion sat in the front rows, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and grief. They'd waited over a year for someone to tell the truth about what had really happened to their loved ones. "And what happened to those letters after your husband's death?" the prosecutor asked. "They disappeared from our house the night after the funeral. Someone broke in while I was staying with neighbors. They took everything: Jonathan's notebook, his copies of the letters, even his work clothes." The defense attorney leaned forward like a predator sensing weakness. "Mrs. Hartwell, isn't it true that you burned those papers yourself? That you were paid by the mining company to destroy evidence?" Eliza felt the courtroom's attention focus on her like sunlight through a magnifying glass. This was the moment that would determine whether justice prevailed or whether the powerful men who'd ordered Jonathan's death would walk free. "No," she said firmly. "I never took money from the mining company. I never destroyed any evidence. And I never had anything to do with my husband's death." "Yet you fled St. Louis immediately after the funeral," the defense attorney pressed. "The actions of an innocent woman?" "I fled because I was pregnant, poor, and frightened," Eliza replied, her voice growing stronger. "My husband was dead. I had no income. And people were starting to whisper, that I was somehow responsible for the mine explosion. I left because I had a baby to protect. The courtroom erupted in whispers until Judge Morrison's gavel restored order. The defense attorney wasn't finished, though. He produced a document from his briefcase with the flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. Mrs. Hartwell, I have here a bank record showing a deposit of $500 into an account bearing your name, made 3 days before the mine explosion. How do you explain that? Eliza stared at the paper in shock. She'd never seen it before, never opened any account in St. Louis beyond the small savings account she'd shared with Jonathan. The document looked official, complete with stamps and signatures, but she knew it was a lie. I don't know anything about that account, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. I never received any money from anyone. So, you deny this bank record is genuine? I'm saying someone created that account without my knowledge. Someone who wanted to make me look guilty. The defense attorney smiled with satisfaction. Or someone who's been caught in a lie and is now desperately trying to escape the consequences. Marcus half rose from his seat in the gallery, his face dark with anger. But Tom Johnson pulled him back down. This was Eliza's fight now, and she had to win it with truth rather than force. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, I'd like to call a rebuttal witness. To everyone's surprise, a small, nervous man entered the courtroom. He was neatly dressed but clearly uncomfortable, glancing around like he expected someone to attack him at any moment. State your name for the record, the prosecutor said. Henry Watkins. I'm a clerk at First National Bank in St. Louis. Mr. Watkins, have you seen this bank record before? Watkins examined the document with shaking hands. Yes, sir. I helped create it. The courtroom fell silent. Even the defense attorney looked confused. Are you saying this record is legitimate? The prosecutor asked. No, sir. I'm saying it's a forgery. A very good one, but still a forgery. Watkins's voice grew stronger as he continued. Mr. Garrison from the mining company came to me 6 months ago. He paid me $50 to create false bank records showing payments to Mrs. Hartwell. Said it was for a legal matter. The defense attorney shot to his feet. This is outrageous. This witness is obviously lying. Am I? Watkins pulled another document from his coat. Because I kept a copy of the real records, along with Mr. Garrison's written instructions on exactly what he wanted me to forge. The revelation hit the courtroom like lightning. The mining company hadn't just tried to frame Eliza, they'd been stupid enough to leave a paper trail of their crimes. In trying to destroy her credibility, they destroyed their own. Judge Morrison examined the documents carefully before addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, given this new evidence, I'm declaring a recess so that both sides can review these materials. Court will resume tomorrow morning. As the courtroom emptied, Eliza found herself surrounded by the families of the other miners. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had died alongside Jonathan, took her hands with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth. But even as Eliza accepted their gratitude, she knew the real battle was just beginning. The mining company still had powerful friends and unlimited money. They wouldn't give up easily, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. Marcus appeared at her side, Mercy babbling happily in his arms. You did good today, he said quietly. Jonathan would be proud. It's not over yet, Eliza replied, looking back at the courthouse where tomorrow's fate awaited. They'll come back with more tricks, more lies. Then we'll be ready for them, Marcus said, and she heard the absolute certainty in his voice. Because we've got something they don't have. What's that? The truth, and people who love you enough to fight for it. As they walked away from the courthouse, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year. Hope that justice might actually prevail. The final day of the trial dawned gray and threatening, with storm clouds gathering over Topeka, like an omen of the battle to come. Eliza sat in the witness chair for the second time, facing a courtroom packed with reporters, mining officials, and families of the dead miners, all waiting to see if truth would triumph over power and money. Mrs. Hartwell, the prosecutor said, yesterday we heard testimony about forged bank records. Today I want to ask you about something else. Your relationship with Marcus Reed. Eliza glanced toward Marcus, who sat holding Mercy with an expression of quiet confidence. They'd prepared for this question, knowing the defense would try to attack her character through their unconventional relationship. "Mr. Reed saved my life," she said simply. "When I had nowhere else to turn, he offered me shelter and protection. He's a good man who's never asked for anything I wasn't willing to give." "And what is the nature of your relationship now?" "We're engaged to be married. As soon as this trial is over, we're going to start our life together as a real family." The defense attorney rose like a shark smelling blood. "Mrs. Hartwell, isn't it true that Mr. Reed purchased you at a public auction? That you were literally sold to the highest bidder?" The question hung in the air like poison, designed to make her sound like a woman of loose morals who couldn't be trusted. Eliza felt the courtroom's attention focus on her with uncomfortable intensity. "I was desperate and starving, with a baby to feed," she said, her voice steady despite the shame the question stirred up. "I made a choice that kept my daughter alive. I'm not ashamed of doing whatever it took to protect her." "So you admit you were essentially a prostitute?" "I admit I was a mother who chose survival over pride," Eliza shot back, fire flashing in her eyes. "And I'd make the same choice again if it meant keeping my child safe." The unexpected strength in her answer seemed to take the defense attorney by surprise. He'd expected her to crumble under the attack on her reputation, not to stand firm in defense of her choices. "Let me ask you this," he continued, changing tactics. "How do we know you didn't kill your husband yourself? A woman desperate enough to sell herself might be desperate enough to commit murder." Before Eliza could answer, a commotion at the back of the courtroom interrupted the proceedings. The doors burst open, and Sheriff Williams entered with two men in chains, executives from the Whitfield Mining Company, who'd been arrested on federal charges. "Your Honor," Sheriff Williams announced, "these men have just confessed to conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and bribery of public officials. They've admitted to ordering the deaths of Jonathan Hartwell and David Walsh." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Judge Morrison's gavel banged repeatedly as he tried to restore order. The defense attorney looked like he'd been struck by lightning, while the prosecutor smiled with satisfaction. "Furthermore," Sheriff Williams continued, "they've provided evidence that the mine explosion was intentionally caused to silence Jonathan Hartwell before he could expose their safety violations." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Jonathan hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered, along with 11 other innocent men, to protect corporate profits and cover up criminal negligence. Mrs. Patterson and the other miners' widows began to weep, finally hearing confirmation of what they'd suspected all along. Their husbands had died not because of bad luck or dangerous work, but because of deliberate murder committed by men in expensive suits who valued money more than human life. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, rising to his feet, "in light of this new evidence, the prosecution moves for immediate dismissal of all charges against Mrs. Hartwell." "Motion granted," Judge Morrison said without hesitation. "Mrs. Hartwell, you are free to go. The court extends its apologies for the suffering you've endured due to these false accusations." The courtroom erupted in applause as Eliza stood on shaking legs. After more than a year of running, hiding, and fighting for her life, it was finally over. She was free, truly free, to build the life she wanted with the people she loved. Marcus was at her side instantly, pulling her into an embrace that lifted her feet off the ground. Mercy laughed and clapped her hands, as if she understood that something wonderful had just happened. "It's over," Marcus whispered in her ear. "Really over. We can go home now." "Home," Eliza repeated, savoring the word. For so long, home had been wherever she could find temporary safety. Now, it meant something entirely different. A place where she belonged, where she was loved, where her worth wasn't measured by what others were willing to pay for her. As they left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions and the families of the dead miners surrounded them with gratitude. But Eliza's attention was focused on the simple gold ring Marcus had offered her months ago, now finally sliding onto her finger where it belonged. "Mrs. Reed," he said softly, testing out her new name. "I like the sound of that," she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. 3 hours later, they stood before the circuit preacher in the garden behind the Johnson farm, exchanging vows, while prairie flowers swayed in the breeze, and Mercy babbled contentedly in Sarah Johnson's arms. The ceremony was simple, but it represented something precious: the triumph of love over fear, truth over lies, and hope over despair. Do you, Marcus Reed, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the small gathering with absolute conviction. And do you, Eliza Hartwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? Eliza looked into Marcus's eyes and saw her future reflected there, not the desperate survival she'd fought for since Jonathan's death, but a real life filled with love, laughter, and the kind of happiness she'd thought was lost forever. I do, she said, and sealed her promise with a kiss that tasted like freedom itself. As they danced to Tom Johnson's fiddle playing under the Kansas stars, Mercy sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, Eliza realized that her worth had never been determined by auction bids or legal accusations. It had always been measured by her capacity to love and be loved in return. And by that measure, she was richer than any mining company executive could ever dream of being.